The purpose of this class is to learn about the beginnings of Judaism and the Jewish people, which consists of two concepts that are very much linked. And as you all know, or you're in the process of assimilating this concept, Judaism is not a religion like most other religions, and it's not a peoplehood as most other peoplehoods. It is a combination of both a peoplehood or a nation and a religion and a culture. And in modern times, we use the term civilization, Judaism as a civilization, and it can be applied to all streams of Judaism. Maybe with the exception of the radical Hasidim, like the Satmar, who deny Zionism and the state of Israel and other things. But anyway, the theme today is the Bible. And I know all of you from maybe Justin. I don't know you that I only meet you now, but all the others I've known for years, and I know that you have quite a bit of a background in Judaism. You've been learning for many years, some of you, and others just for a few, but still, you know what we're talking about. The Bible is the foundation of the Jewish civilization, both as a religion and as a nation. The first Jew is Abraham. Charles is here. Hi, Charles.
Hello,
Charles
how are you?
Turkey. Hello. The first Jew is Abraham, of whom we read in the book of Genesis. Actually, in our reading cycle, this is the time, that we read about Abraham. And Abraham is chosen by God to go to leave his area of birth and where he's dwelling with his family, and take his wife and his nephew and go to the land I will show you. And what is the promise to Abraham? This is the land that will belong to you, the land of Canaan, Israel, for you and your generations after you. And the only thing that you have to give it back, or on your side, is to abide by the Brit. Brit is the pact or the covenant. It's the covenant of circumcision, that through that covenant, Abraham acquiesces to be a follower of the one God, which is a new idea in the world. The area where he came from, the ancient Middle East, had hundreds of clans or tribes, and they were all idolatrous. They were all polytheistics. And polytheistic means that they had different gods for different purposes. Sometimes a local god. If you moved, you had a different god, and a god of good harvests, and so on. A whole pantheon of gods. And here comes the notion that there is one God with one people and one nation and one piece of land. Over the centuries, these concepts evolved, and the Jewish people became a people that lived throughout the world. Actually, for almost 2,000 years, there was no independent state in what is today Israel. It's only since 1948 that there is a Jewish state. But there is also a Jewish diaspora, the Jews throughout the world, mainly in the US, but also throughout other nations, or most other nations in the world, but the bulk are in the US. So what is the Bible then? Going back to our topic. The Bible, as I like to say over the years, and those who've heard this, I'm sure you've heard me say it, didn't come down from heaven as a complete book. What is the Bible? The Bible is by the name in the Latin root, it denotes a book or a collection of books, the books. And over a period of time, centuries, different books became canonized. You know, the canonized is a modern word that you use to reflect books that have come into the Bible. And who introduced these books into the Bible? The authority of, or the Jewish authority at a particular period. For example, the oldest part of the Bible consists of three main groups. You know, the acronym in Hebrew is Tanakh. Tanakh comes from the T for Torah, the N for Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Chav for the Ketuvim, the other books. This is a very, very general definition. The three parts. One is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The second, books that involve the stories of the prophets. And third is other writings. The other writings are historical books. There are also the book of Psalms, which are prayers, basically. The book of Proverbs, as the name indicates, it's proverbs or aphorisms, good words. And then special books that, like the book of Esther, the book of Ruth, the book of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet, Job, and other books, you know, that do not involve prophets. And we'll speak about prophets in a little while. So these are the three parts. The oldest, as I said, is the Torah. And when was the word Torah accepted as a holy book? A book that is separate of other writings, that it acquires a special status in the history of the people. We think, scholars think, that the Torah was canonized or accepted around the time of Ezra, Ezra the scribe. Who was Ezra? Ezra was the leader of the Jewish people, Ezra and Nehemiah, around the time of the return from Persia, from ancient Persia, where the Jews had been in exile after the destruction of the first temple. So around the 5th century before the Common Era. This is after the first of the period of the first temple that endured for a period of 400 plus years. You know, the Jews then were exiled. A lot went to Babylonia. Then in Babylonia, they dwelt for about a generation and a half. And all of a sudden, the Babylonian Empire is destroyed by the Persian Empire. Isn't that interesting? And the Persian Empire now is much more benevolent to the minorities living in the empire they conquered. So while the Babylonians did, of course, destroyed the first temple, destroyed the Jewish state, and so on, now the Persians allow the Jews to return and build their temple. mind you, not granting them full independence, but they can go back by the land where they came from, rebuild their temple, establish their rituals, and live as Jews, even under Persian dominance. But still, they could go back, and they did in different waves. They did not all go right away. Some stayed where they were. Like in modern times, not every Jew went to Israel when the state was declared. Some went right back, others came back, others went, and so on. A whole history. But now, in one of these waves, not the first waves, comes Ezra the scribe, he's called. And we read in his book, and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah are books that are now part of the Bible, but we have information there. And the information that we know from that book is that the Jews read the Torah 3 times a week at the market, in the open market. So this was established by Ezra the scribe. And according to later traditions, they said that if Moses hadn't given the Torah to Israel, Ezra would have done it, because he was almost at the same level as Moses. So around that time, the 5 books of Moses, and I'm not really going into the details because it's more complicated than what I'm saying. But around that time, the 5th century before the Common Era, around 444, that's a ballpark year, before the Common Era. So, and then, of course, the Jews continued to return, and there's of course, a second temple was established in Jerusalem, not as magnificent and ostentatious as the first one, but it was a temple in which the Kohanim, the priests, continued to offer the daily offerings, the special offerings, all the different rituals prescribed in the Torah. And the ritual continued. So this is what is called the Second Commonwealth, which will endure with ups and downs until the year 70 of the Common Era. Okay, that's when the Romans came and destroyed the Second Temple. In the meantime, the Greeks had come a few hundred years before and established Greek culture, Hellenistic culture, and a lot of changes were made because of the influence of the Greek culture upon the local culture. In Israel, it was the Jewish or Hebrew culture. So a mishmash, a combination or an assimilation of cultures took place. Even I have a friend who is called Alexander. He's Jewish. I've known him for 60 plus years, way back in Argentina. And he said, do you know what is the Hebrew name for Alexander? And I told him, Alexander became a Jewish name since the time in which Alexander from Macedonia, Alexander the Great, conquered Israel and established new cities like Alexandria in Egypt, and Greek culture came into the country, and a lot of Jews were named Alexander. Many, if you want an example of the 20th century, a lot of Jews or Americans were called Frank or Franklin because of FDR, who was a hero during his long period as president of the US and fighting in World War II. So this is one example of Greek culture entering into the country, into the Jewish culture. So this is the first part of the Tanakh, of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses. The second is the Nevi'im, the prophets. Now, there are many books in the prophetic list, and you have them in your handouts that were given before the course. There are some books that are historical, like the book of Joshua and Judges. Those are the first books after the Torah, and then the books of Samuel and Kings, and then books with the names of prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Those are the 3 big ones. And then come the smaller books, not because the prophets were smaller, but the writings were more concise, like Amos and Micah and Jonah, and there are 12 of them. Those are called the minor prophets. But it's a whole phenomenon in biblical times that occurred only in Israel, in the north and in the south of Israel, because at one time the country was divided in 2. There was a rupture and a secession after King Solomon. But we might talk about it later, but it's an important factor. But there were 2 Jewish states after Solomon. His son could not control the north, and the north seceded under the generals and established a different temple in Samaria, Shomron today, and the kingdom of Judah in the south, with the capital in Jerusalem and the temple. So who were these people that we call Nevi'im or prophets? Anybody has an idea? Just to involve you a little bit. It's not an exam, it's just to dialogue a little bit. What are the special characteristics of the prophets? And each one was different. Yes, Johan.
They directly received revelation from God.
Pardon?
Take off your mask.
They received revelation from God directly.
Yes, these people at least claimed to have a revelation of God, from God. According to tradition of the rabbis in later times, the revelations to the prophets were in different degrees. Most of them were at this level, and only one was at a higher level, and that was Moses. Okay? Of course, the patriarchs came earlier, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and others, but that's the sort of the beginnings. The Jewish people starts as a people, not as a clan. As a clan, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. But then as a people, as a large nation, it's with Moses coming out of Egypt with a great event that is the Exodus from Egypt, a turning point in the life of that nation. It's like Independence Day. Moses was a prophet, of course. And God spoke according to the book of Exodus, face to face. What that means, we leave to the imagination, because Moses had a face, but God did not. God has no form, no shape, no mouth, no tongue, no vocal cords, but the Torah speaks in terms of God spoke to Moses, or God took the people out of Egypt with an outstretched arm and a strong hand. God doesn't have arms or hands, and so on. Or God was fuming through his nostrils when God was upset. These are anthropomorphisms. That means describing God in human terms. We don't have terms to describe God because God has no shape, no form, no. God is not a mensch even. God is not a human being. So, as Maimonides says, Divra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam. The Torah spoke in the language of humans when describing God. So, for lack of better words, they described God in human terms. But let us not be confused. God has no mouth or vocal cords. Yes, it's just.
So I know that that's kind of what's been thought, but nobody knows what God looks like except for, nobody really knows that. That'd be speculation on his form, correct? And then I know later, or in the Torah, it says that we were created in God's image. So I just, wanted to see where that goes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, it's not later; it's earlier. In the first book of the whole Bible, in Genesis, in the 6 days of creation, on the sixth day, God created humans, Adam, and eventually Eve. There are two stories of creation, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and they're different. That's to confuse us even more, But there are some things in common, that they were created, humans were created. In the first story, Adam was created first, and then Eve was created later. In the second story, they were created at the same time, and so on, and many other differences. But it says, "Nase Adam b'tzalmeinu kitmutenu." Let us, God says in the royal plural, let us make a human in our image and shape, and this is what you're referring to. And this is again a topic of great speculation. The shape, the human shape, is not the shape of God. God has no corporality. It has no body. It might be a spirit. It might be an idea or a power or a combination of all these things. But they're very ethereal. There's no corporality.
Where does it say that? Where does it talk about his ethereal being like that then?
Not in the Bible. In
Okay.
the Bible, it says it's always God speaking to the prophets and so on. God speaks. But as the thinkers became more sophisticated, Jewish thinkers in medieval times especially, and even more in modern times, it says God has no shape. If God had a body, then God might get sick and need to see a doctor. Things like that,
Rabbi, but
yes.
Somewhere when that there's this dialogue and God says, "I am that I am." It's
Yes.
there. So right there, you have that sense of somebody understanding that this presence or entity exists in a form, in some sort of a shape beyond what we can comprehend. Beyond it, it's there, and I am there because I am here.
Yeah. Yes, I am who I am, and some interpreted that I am, was, and will be what I am. And then this is when Moses asks God,
Mhm.
Areini na et kevodecha, show me your glory. And God responds, I am who I am. And it's
unquestionable. Take it on
yeah,
faith.
it doesn't speak of shape anyway. You know,
Mhm.
I exist. And one thing that was discussed by thinkers, you know, even commentators of the Bible, is the question whether the world was there always or had a beginning. And the prevalent posture is in Hebrew, yesh me'ayin. It's God created something out of nothing.
Big Bang.
Eh?
The Big Bang Theory.
Yeah. Big Bang, whatever,
Mhm.
created something out of nothing. And why? You know, I'm now going off on a tangent. Why? I mean, the basic question of all humans since the beginning of civilization is why there is something. Before we were born, we were not even aware that we were nothing. Who knows what's going to happen after we go? Speculations abound, but so this whole mystery of creation led people to start to think that there is a power that created all this, or a variety of powers. You know. And then all these myths of antiquity started to proliferate. The lives of the gods, and eventually with Abraham, the life or the one God. And that is you know, in a very brief form, the beginning of questioning. You know, I interpreted that story in the Garden of Eden not to eat of the tree of knowledge,
Mhm.
that God tells Adam and Eve, they shall not eat of this tree of knowledge. All the rest, you have plenty. Of course, when they tell you, you can eat out of a dozen things, but on one you cannot. So human beings as we are, we go directly to the one that we are not supposed to go. And sure enough, but that is a way of explaining the loss of innocence. We have an inquisitive mind, all of us, some more, some less, but we want to know. And this is what leads human beings in search of knowledge. And in antiquity, within the realm of what they knew in antiquity, you know, the earth was flat and so on. And today we know much more, so we can appreciate that knowledge. But we still have questions. As Einstein said, the more I learn, the more I realize that I don't know a lot. You know? That is yet to be learned. So, but going back to, you know, I hope I at least try to answer these questions. But the prophet, all but Moses, according to the tradition, they received the revelation not in a face-to-face manner, but in a dream, either a daydream or a night dream. So it was a sort of a lesser revelation to them, not face-to-face. Whatever it was, we don't know exactly the experience. We do know from the books of the Bible that there were schools of prophets. There were people who went to school to become prophets. Bnei Nevi'im, it's called in Hebrew. And people who went and had seances. They went, say, into the forest or into a garden and tried to be inspired, to meditate and to maybe to sing or to be inspired. And some went into frenzies. There's one thing is to say I have the revelation from God, and another thing is to say I think I have that revelation, and I'll tell you what God told me. It's a knife with two sharp ends. Prophecy was important, but at the time it could be cause of divisions, because the issue of which word are we to believe arose as different prophets came up to the picture. So at one time, towards the end of the Second Commonwealth, the new leaders of the people, the rabbis, who were the scholars at the time, decided that the period of prophecy had ended. In part was in defense from the Christian example. A new prophet, a new Jesus came up and came with a new formula. And a new formula that created conflicts. Eventually, even 650 years after Jesus, came another prophet, and that is the prophet Muhammad, when he arose and established a new religion, which today is has a huge following, in over a billion people. And what did Prophet Muhammad say? I come as a prophet along the lines of Abraham and Moses and Jesus and all the others. He touched all the bases, but I am the seal of prophecy. In other words, I am the last one. And by saying that, he implied that nobody will come after me with a new doctrine. So this was at the basis of Islam. But again, deviating. I want to go back to prophecy. The prophet is, as I said, a unique phenomenon in Israel. It did not occur in any other civilization. And the prophet had a revelation from God, but the prophet was a person conflicted by his, in most cases was a man, by his two loves, the love of God and the love of the people. And we see that in Moses, and I use Moses because it's the best known example. After Mount Sinai, when the people create, they received the Torah, but in the midst of it, they created an idol, and they were worshiping this golden calf. And Moses came down from the mountain and threw the two tablets to the floor and smashed them and broke them. And God said, Moses, I'm going to get rid of these people. I'll just start again, just with your tribe, the Levites, and forget about the others, we'll get rid of the others. And that's when the majestic move by Moses takes place. And Moses tells God, and this is in the book of Exodus, under my dead body. I'm using a modern expression, but Moses says to God, two arguments he uses. The first argument is, remember your promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You promised them that you'll be with the people. The people are people, they're human. They're weak and so on. But they are your people. You brought them. And second, you brought them out of Egypt. Just a few months ago, you brought them out of Egypt. What will the Egyptians say? What God is this, the God of the Hebrews? He takes them out and then kills them in the desert? No. So God relents. And this is, in brief, the story. But it took Moses all the strength he had, and he stood up to God, speak truth to power, basically. And that is a major characteristic of the prophets in Israel. They stand up to God to defend the people. They chastise the people. Wherever you see the prophets complain. You people are weak. You people don't do the right thing. The Torah says you shall defend the poor, you shall work for the orphan and help the widow. And look, you're not doing that. Instead, you're collecting wealth for yourself and let the poor go down the drain. It sounds like politics in our own days. And the prophet says, chastise the people. But if God wants to destroy them, the prophet defends them. He says, this is what we have. These are our people. These people, some are great, some are charitable, some are, thoughtful. Others are garbage. But this is our people. We have all the types. So the United States of people, in a way. You have to get everybody and protect them. And this is the prophets of Israel were the socialists of their time. They were in favor of helping the indigent. The Torah itself has long chapters of redistribution of the wealth. Not completely. I mean, they know that there will be rich and poor, but the very poor need help. And that's what the Torah says. And the Torah says, the very poor will never be extinguished from the world. There always will be people who need help. Unfortunately, this is true. So we can always have an opportunity to help out. But this is the role of the prophet. The role of, at times, they have other postures. For example, the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, which is the Haftarah of the first day of Shavuot. Shavuot commemorates the revelation at Sinai, so they selected the readings, the prophetic readings, along lines of prophecy as well, revelation. And he has a fantastic description of God. He says, I saw an image of God, and he describes it in a fantastic way, with 4 sides, with 4 heads, each one representing a different animal, and with wings and rollers on the feet and so on. And it would move like a very complicated picture. Some scholars have tried to draw it or to sculpt it because it was three-dimensional, an image of a God. Of course, it's very mystic. It's one of those chapters that the rabbis said, don't study them alone. Study with somebody else because you might go meshuggah, you might get crazy if you try to interpret or to study the mystic writings. And this is in general how the attitude towards mysticism was. Or even the book of Genesis, the first book of the first chapter, the creation. It's symbolic, God did not create in 6 days, maybe in 6 billion years, created everything, or whatever it is. It's only a myth of what happened, just like the story of the Tower of Babel was an explanation of why God created different languages. Can you imagine? I spoke about this at the Minyan and had heard it before. If the world had only one language, wouldn't that be easier to communicate? But God had diversity. God didn't want that everybody will be the same. Diversity enhances culture and enhances ideas and approaches to life and so on. It makes life more entertaining, I think, that we are different. So long as we don't go to war. Mm-hmm. But the cultural wars are interesting because out of those cultural wars, new culture comes out. You see that in music, you see it in paintings, in sculptures, in the world of literature. See all types of things in the movies. And everybody influences everybody else. So this is the manner of the prophet, a person who is in constant dilemma or conflict, personal conflict, and he always loses personally, because when he tries to defend the people in front of God, God gets annoyed with him. If he tries to tell the people you're not doing what God expects from you, the people get annoyed. So they all get annoyed with the prophet. It's like when you try to make peace between two parties, you're the go-between. After a while, you might succeed, but everybody blames the go-between or the arbitrator. So in some respects, the prophet is that type of arbitrator, but always with justice in mind. For example, Amos. Amos is a book that has about 14 or 15 chapters, and chapters are about a page and so on. So it's not a long book, but Amos is the epitome of the prophet who has the concept of justice as the top priority in his agenda. When people abandon justice, then it's chaos in society. And we see it here in the politics of our days. When there's no justice, the whole society suffers. And in general, I'll give you an example of, before I spoke about the secession from in ancient history of Israel, the secession of the kingdom of the north. The first king was King Saul. King Saul was crowned as king by the prophet Samuel. And we read about the birth of Samuel on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. The Haftorah is the birth of the prophet Samuel. And he became the kingmaker, because before there were no kings in Israel. There were judges, and Samuel was a prophet and a judge as well. The judges were people who arose at a time of need. And the most important time of need was when there was a war to go to. There were 12 tribes. We think that's a nice round number, 12 tribes. And there was no unifying power, no federal power. Each tribe was on its own, but they had a few things in common. They worshiped the same God, and they had some cultural traits together, and they protected each other. But when there was a war, they wanted all the other people of their pact to come and go to war with them. Like we have NATO in our days, and hopefully we're getting back to NATO in January. And because those are our friends. So the tribes, when there was somebody attacking one of them, the others came. And we know from the book of Judges that not all the tribes went and fought with all the other wars in the midst of the 12 tribes. So little by little, these 12 tribes became united and formed, to use the Greek name, an amphictyony, a confederation, because they had the same God and they worshiped along similar lines, and they had a certain cultural affinity. And eventually Samuel is born, and they decide to become like all the other nations. All the other nations have one God, and one king, and they want a king. At the beginning, Samuel is upset. Why do you want to? God is king. You don't need a king. When God needs a general to go to war, we'll find a general, like the judges, like Samson and Deborah for a female judge, and so on. They led the people in battle, and then after they settled down after the war, they became judges. They sort of ran the government of the tribes. But now they wanted a king. And the first king is Saul, and eventually Saul, who has a son called Jonathan, and then has a young, ambitious person in his retinue that's called David. And David is very ambitious, and David is very able, and Saul, who at the beginning loved David, starts to be jealous. And eventually the conflict gets worse and worse. And as you know, David becomes king, and Saul is dismissed by the main person who crowned him, by Samuel. He says, we didn't renew your contract. You're fired. Basically, that's what he says. And David is proclaimed king, and he's very popular. David is full of peccadillos. He's not a perfect person, but he is very, very religious. He's, according to tradition, the author of the Psalms, which are prayers to God. And he's very, very thoughtful, in spite of being a womanizer and many other things that he did that were not to his credit. And and the kingdom is enhanced, and eventually he's succeeded by one of his younger sons. He had sons with many wives, plus a few with other women, but the legal sons were from the wives. And the son of Bathsheba is Solomon. And Solomon, by a coup within the palace, is the victorious heir to the throne. And Solomon is the epitome of wisdom, but he has his weaknesses as well. And he was the great builder of the temple in Jerusalem. And by all descriptions, not only the biblical, but descriptions of other witnesses to the temple in antiquity, this was a magnificent building. But we know, how did Solomon build it? He didn't go and work. He extracted work from all the tribes. Every 3 months of the year, every single man had to donate his work to the building of the temple. The bringing of the cedars from Lebanon, and the big stones that you see today in the famous wall, and from the Shfela, from the area of the shore. They didn't have trucks and all these machinery that we have today. It was all by human labor, maybe some ox here and there, oxen to help bring huge stones, but then they had to be placed. It was an enormous operation. And he was ruthless in that respect. When he died, when Solomon dies, his son, Rehoboam, was advised by the people close to the court. The country is fed up with the taxations of labor and also of money to build the temple. Of course, it was a very costly proposition. And the temple is built now. Don't give them new taxes. Give them a break. And Rehoboam thinks about it, but shortly thereafter decides, what the heck? I am the king. I'm going to do what I want. And I need more money, so I'll extract more taxes. Mm-hmm. And that's when the first rebellion took place. And then the tribes that were far away, further north from Judah, the temple was and on the border of Judah and Benjamin, then the 10 tribes to the north of them separated. And that's why we are called Jews or Yehudim, from the tribe of Yehudah, from Judah. That's why we're not called Israelites. Sometimes we are, but the proper name is Jew, from the tribe of Judah. And the 10 tribes formed a separate state, sometimes in coalitions with the tribe of Judah, sometimes not, with other coalitions. Eventually, the tribes of the north lost their independence in 722, much earlier than Judah. Judah stayed until 568, for another 150 years. That was when the first temple was destroyed. So again, you see that justice was not always preserved in ancient Israel. Jews were people like every other people. Well, some were benevolent, some were charitable, others look for numero uno first, want to become wealthier. So whatever I can grab, I'll keep. But the prophet, without exceptions, the prophets were all in favor of justice and help to those who are the weakest link in society. And we all know who are the weakest, especially the poor and the stranger, and as the Torah says, the widow and the orphan. Those were the classic people who were prone to being the weakest link. Of course, the poor and the stranger had real problems. Some widows had enough money, but especially the orphans were defenseless or in the hands of people who took care of them and at times ill-advised them or benefited from whatever belonged to the orphan. They took advantage of them. So other prophets are there with different, other books of the prophets are there for a separate lesson, but few of them. One of them is the book of Jonah. The book of Jonah, and Jonah has different characteristics from all the other prophets. It's probably an invented myth, an invented story, but it's read on the day of Yom Kippur during the afternoon service as an important lesson that God is open to the atonement, not only of the Jews, but the atonement of every other person in the world, whatever the origins, whatever their religion or their nationality or their gender and so on. It's words that echo today in our own society, that God listens to the cry of every human being in distress. And that's the story of Jonah. So each prophet has a slightly different message, but the message of justice is the one that is prevalent throughout prophetic literature. Now, do you have any questions so far? Okay, so we'll go on. Yes, Johan.
Rabbi, I know there are books like Maccabees and Jubilees that are considered like Apocrypha by the Christian church. What's the rabbinic position on those? Do we consider them to be just as true or expanded?
There are books that belong in time to the time of the later books of our Bible. That's a whole different chapter,
Sorry.
We started to canonize the Torah, and then afterwards I probably didn't finish. But in times of the Second Temple, other books became popular among Jews. Some books of the prophets, historical works, the book of Psalms, for example, was used for prayers and so on. But they were not canonized. We think that they were canonized in the later days of the Second Temple and the early days of the rabbis who took charge of the leadership after the Second Temple was destroyed. at the end of the first century and into the second century. We see that the books were accepted, and they use these terms as metame et hayadayim, the books that defile the hands if you touch them, because they're holy. So you shouldn't deal with them in a profane way. And so we don't have the records. We only have a few records for some of the books, as they were discussed in these yeshivas, in the schoolhouses where the rabbis met. The rabbis, they're not like rabbis today. The rabbis was a title for a sage, a person who knew the heritage of the Jewish people and was there to organize the future of the community. And they created the Mishnah and the Talmud and other things. So Judaism survived after the destruction, which it was not supposed to. Judaism was reinvented after the Second Temple was destroyed, because at that time, the whole temple ritual that was sustaining the Jewish spiritual values for more than 1,200 years was destroyed. So the high priest and the other priests had no role anymore. There was no altar. So that was supplanted by prayer. The kings that were puppets at the very end of the Romans, still, there were no kings. So who was the leader? So they created a new leadership, and that was the rabbis, the sages, the scholars. These were the new leaders. It was a transition. It was not decreed anywhere, but they took the reins of the future of the people in their hands, and they restructured Judaism. There's no temple, but now there's prayer. They composed what is today the Siddur, the prayers. Most of them we still say them today with minor changes. The Agada for Passover, and so on. So the second institution was the institution of study. The study as a commandment, which they call Torah. Ritual or prayer is avodah, and the third element in the formula was gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, like charity, benevolence, sympathy, empathy, and so on, all the good values. This was what was created by the sages, the rabbis, right at the end of the biblical era. So they composed the canon of the Bible, and they decreed, this is it. It now has a beginning and an end. It didn't come all at once, but through a period of evolution, we have come to accept the holy books. And whatever is there can be quoted in order to create now the halacha. The halacha is the way of observance. So, the Torah says to observe the Sabbath. Now we will tell you what it means to observe, what you can do or what you must do and what you must not do. The same with the eating rituals, the kosher laws. They established them based on And the same generalities, when the Sabbath starts, when the Sabbath ends, what the prayers should be, and hundreds of legislation, some in the minutiae. Also laws that pertain to business. What is allowed in business? What type of interest can you, if you are going to charge, and why is it allowed on some occasions and mostly not allowed in other occasions? And then they even instituted ways of changes. I call them the amendments to the Bible. The constitution in this country is a constitution, but then there were a few amendments, like almost 20 amendments or so.
More.
24, right? And we were talking about the 19th Amendment with the vote, for women and for blacks and so on. And these were not in the beginning. For example, the Torah says you shall not charge interest. In the antiquity, when everybody had a little farm or a few animals, nobody needed loans. But when they became more urbanized, in order to establish a business or to buy a home, you needed a loan. So how could they do it without charging interest? Who would give interest? Or who would loan if after 7 years the loan was dissolved, annulled? Nobody wanted to lose money. So they created devices, or takanot in Hebrew. It's the same as tikkun, repairing or amending the Torah. And we see in American legislation, we see the same pattern. A society has to move on, otherwise it becomes frozen in time and disappears. The flexibility is what allows it to endure and to continue into the future. So now comes the whole Torah the whole Bible was included. We have one passage in which they discuss the book of the Song of Solomon, or Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs. And Rabbi Akiva is the decider. He makes the final argument. And his final argument, because the book of the Song of Solomon, is an erotic book, basically. The name of God is not even mentioned. It's a collection of shepherds' songs of love, the male for the female and vice versa, and very erotic at times. And so the rabbi said, no, it's a euphemism. It's a book that describes the love of God for Israel and vice versa. The male figure is God, the female figure is Israel, and they express their love for each other in these poems. Yes, Justin.
So to expound on Johan's question, it seems like the Jewish Bible was being canonized at the same time that the Christian Bible was being canonized. So I was just curious if the Jewish Bible influenced the Christian canonized Bible, or if it was the other way around, or if it was a little bit of both.
Well, it's a good figure. And I was getting to the Apocrypha and to the Epigraphy, but it takes me a long time. In the Jewish experience, the evolution to canonized books had started already before the surge of Christianity. As I said, Ezra was a half a millennium before Jesus. So he canonized at least the Torah. And then in later centuries, still during the time of the Second Temple, many of the books of the prophets made the rounds. They were accepted in general by the population. These were books that were read. They were in scrolls, like the scroll of Esther. Books in the format that we have now, or now we all have them in internet, but in printed books, it didn't exist yet. They were all in scrolls, in manuscripts. So eventually they followed a similar process. Christians developed their own holy books, but they always accepted the Jewish Bible. So every book in the Hebrew Bible is part of the New Testament, or part of the Christian Bible. Then they have the additions which they call the New Testament. So this is because of the Christians calling themselves the true Israel. See, the followers of Jesus said that the Messiah anticipated in Jewish law and lore is Jesus. And therefore, the historical continuity of the Jewish people is what is now the followers of Jesus, or the Messiah. So this was their belief. Verus Israel in Latin. The Jews that remained Jews said, no, the Messiah has not arrived because everything that was promised is not here. The era of peace and understanding in the world has not arrived with Jesus. So therefore we stick to our guns, and we are still the Jews of antiquity. And you Christians are a deviation of that. You're a different religion. Eventually, they branched into two. But Christians still call themselves the Verus Israel, the true Israel. and even, I don't want to go on a different tangent now, but to get to the Apocrypha and Pseudo-Epigrapha, these are books that were Jewish books in the time of the later times of the Bible, of the biblical times, in, say, the later centuries of the Second Temple, and were not entered into the Jewish canon, but they were preserved mainly by monks, Christian monks, and they became part and parcel of some editions of the Christian Bible. Not all denominations accepted them, and so on. And they were a few books that are called the Apocrypha or Pseudo-Epigrapha. And they include many books that are truly Jewish, like the Book of Judith, the Book of the Wisdom of Solomon, the various books of Maccabees, the books of Esdras 1 and 2, the books of Baruch. Some are mystical books, but they're all Jewish books. But they did not make it into the canon. They're important books because the scholars read them and they can find tidbits about the time in which they were written and what conflicts were there and so on. They're sources, historical sources of the ancient world. And that's why they are important, but they're not part of the Jewish canon. Sometimes, like the Wisdom of Ben Sira, in Latin it's called Ecclesiasticus, which is not the same as Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. Ecclesiastes is part of the Jewish Bible. It's Kohelet in Hebrew. But Ecclesiasticus is not. it's Book of Ben Sira. It's a very moral book, a book that teaches morality, and it was common. It was present in many Jewish home. People who studied, they collected books. Some were part of the Bible, others were not. But Ecclesiasticus was so well studied that it's even quoted in the Talmud as if it were part of the Bible when it was not. So again, in answer to Johan's question, or concern, these books were preserved mainly by non-Jews, by Christians. The Muslims don't come till much later. So in a certain way, we had a debt of gratitude because these books were preserved. Sometimes in Greek, sometimes in Greek translations, and some people try to reconstruct what was the original Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever it was. So it's a complicated era. Today, the scholars, especially Christian scholars, call that period between the end, towards the end of the Second Temple period, say by the time of the Romans came in the first century, the beginning of the first century before the Common Era, around 70, 68 before the Common Era, until the writing of the Gospels, which are the first Christian books, which is at the end of the first century of the Common Era, when Paul preaches and sends letters, and you have the Gospels. So these become the bulk of the New Testament. They call this period in between the intertestamental period, the end of the Hebrew Bible and the beginning of what Christians call the New Testament. For Jews, we don't like too much the word New Testament, because when you have the word new, it implies that the old is not as good as the new. So for us, the Hebrew Bible is the Bible, and the rest is the Christian Bible, the additions. So sometimes in the way we call things, there is a rationale about it as well.
I don't think Christians would actually agree with you on that, because I went to a Lutheran college and I took a course in Old Testament and I took a course in New Testament. And I think most Christians think the Old Testament is as much part of the Bible as the New Testament.
Oh, yes. I didn't say that they don't think that, because that establishes their continuity. I say that the name might have implications. And it's good you corrected me, that I think we agree. The Christians, of course, they have to accept the Christian. I just read in my computer that Alex Trebek passed away. Anyway, it popped in. The continuity is an essential point in Christianity.
It is.
But from the point of view of the Jew, Christianity is a different religion, based on, it's an Abrahamic religion based on our Hebrew Bible, but then goes on a tangent as well. Islam eventually will do something similar, trying to grasp the prehistory as part of the history of the new people created in Islam. But the history of Christianity is what I call, and many others call, the parting of the ways, takes place at the end of the first century, when Paul, especially Paul, makes the overture to the Gentiles. When the Christians were just one new sect within the Jewish people, they were still part. In those days there were other sects. There were Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes among the Jews, like different parties, if you will, political parties, different agendas. And Jesus was another one, a dynamic teacher who had a personal following. But while they were Jews, they were part of the Jewish people that was a composite of many, many different parties. But when it opened up to the Gentiles, and without discrimination, in the sense of without having the obligation to enter into the Jewish people in a proper way, then by necessity it became a different group.
Yeah, I actually learned the same stuff when I was taking my Old and New Testament class.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, just to complete a few more notions about, we have a few minutes, about the Bible. The Bible is read, the 5 books of Moses is read every week by the Jewish people. And we have 2 ways of reading it. We read annually or triannually. But basically, to make the services a little shorter, we have adopted the triennial cycle, which allows us to make it, the Torah service, a little shorter, and but we keep the pagination. In other words, we don't retard, we don't delay the reading. So we complete the cycle every year, but every year we read 1/3 of the readings. I think we're now on the second of the 3 types of the 3 years. And the prophetic lesson was added by the rabbis. In other words, a chapter or a lesson from the rabbis, which is basically 20 to 30 verses, is added at the completion of the period of study as the prophetic lesson. And it usually has a connection with what the Torah topics are. But it's established for all the world in antiquity. There are a few differences between the Ashkenazi and Sephardi customs or the Italian customs, but basically they're very similar. So there's the book of the prophets. The books of the prophets are used in the lessons for the Sabbath or for holidays. So the prophets are as well studied in depth. Other books are used for special occasions, like the book of Esther for Purim, the book of the Songs of Solomon on Passover, the book of Ruth for Shavuot, the book of Ecclesiastes for Sukkot, and finally the Book of Lamentations for the 9th of Av, which is a day of memorial for the destructions of the temples and other nefarious events in Jewish history. The Book of Psalm is used throughout the liturgy and for other occasions, for funerals, for weddings, etc. They are quoted. And so on. So every aspect of biblical work or biblical literature is part and parcel of the Jewish calendar and the Jewish way of life in daily usage. And okay, this brings us to the end. We have a minute or two for a couple of questions. Yes, Johan.
Rabbi, sorry, I was under the impression that we always read the whole 5 books of Moses in 1 year. Like we just started with Bereshit a few weeks ago. We're going to end with the end of Deuteronomy.
Yes.
Next year.
But even in antiquity, there were two ways of reading it. When in the first centuries of the Common Era, there were two main communities, one in the land of Israel, not in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was practically destroyed, but throughout the land. And they followed the minhag, or the custom of the land, and the other one in Babylonia. In Babylonia, they had the custom of reading it throughout the year. And in Israel, they read it throughout 3 years. So they didn't finish the first year. They were in the middle of the book of Exodus. And then the second year, they went through Exodus and Leviticus and parts of Numbers. And then the third year, they completed. What we did now, towards the middle of the 20th century, was because there was too much noise during the reading of the Torah. It took a long time, and people were on edge. And many a community decided to shorten that period. And in our movement, conservative movement, we shortened. But instead of doing it consecutively over 3 years, we take the portion of that week and divide it in 3 for every portion. So every year we read the first or second or third of the portion. And technically we complete it in 3 years, but we celebrate on Simchat Torah as if we completed the whole thing, because we touched on every passage, on every parasha, on every one of the 50 plus parashiot. Yes.
So this week we'll only get as far as Genesis 20, right? And
yesterday we didn't finish
yesterday. Sorry.
Yeah, and then next Shabbat we'll read the second third of Chaye Sarah, which is the next parasha.
Thank you. I always thought we did the entire thing.
That's in services for your own personal edification. It is advised to read the whole thing in the privacy of your own study. But in the public service, I think it's to shorten the services, and I think it's good to shorten services, because in some congregations they are too long. And I always went for shorter services, but the cantor not always agreed with me. Okay, well, it's nice to see you all, and have a nice day. Enjoy the good weather while it's still here. And nice to see you all.
Oh, it was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
I learned a lot of
Very
stuff.
informative.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
you and good luck to everybody.
That was good.